I'm John Atack, and people are sick and tired of me saying that. I know. Um, it's been suggested by a few people over the years that I talk too much. And I'd just like to say, yes, I do. And I'm really sorry. And Hoyt knows me well enough to say, John, you're talking too much, mate. So,
Oh, I actually enjoy hearing you talk, John, because
oh,
I
that most kind.
not only do I like your voice, but I always learn something, and and I've got a continued book list that continues to grow because you always reference incredible things. My stack of books that I'll probably never read, but I know I should probably have at least on my bookshelf.
Well,
You
at the
know,
moment, I'm reading a great book about Jewish apocalyptic literature, which I think would fascinate you. I'm also
wow,
reading a book about Reconstruction in the South after the Civil War, because that's a subject that's fascinated me for years, but I've never had the time
wow.
to find out about it. And because I'm having to understand Charles Manson's childhood in Virginia, that kind of
Okay.
division that had continued. Do you know?
Sure.
Here's an amazing fact, and put this on your book list. That
Yeah.
I didn't know this. The 50th anniversary of Gettysburg. Well, it wasn't quite the anniversary because they celebrated it on Independence Day, so I don't think it's exact. But Woodrow
Right.
Wilson, the then president, the first Southern president since from Virginia, in fact, since
Right.
the war, um, he gave a little speech at Gettysburg, and I think 55,000 veterans had been brought from all over the country, all expenses paid, to have a kind of tent village for a couple of days
Right.
to remember the carnage of 50 years before. And I think there were more than 100,000. I think it was 160,000 or something blacks fought on the Union side during the
Yeah.
war. Among the veterans, the 55,000 veterans gathered that day at Gettysburg, not one of them was black.
Wow.
Go figure. Do we have
Mm.
a problem?
Yeah, we have a problem.
Oh dear. So anyway, that's got nothing to do with what we're going to
Yeah.
say today. Though we are going to talk about families and division in families, and I suppose that has some relevance.
Yeah,
Um,
it does. No, it
and this
does.
this is, by the way, Hoyt Richards, who's
Oh, nice to see everyone. Always good to be here. And yeah, John and I were talking about it like quite often in these, both of us have worked with families trying to help their loved ones, who might be caught up in some form of a cultic situation, a group, one-on-one, whatever it may be. But there's always a point as you come to know the family over time, as you're working on the particular case, trying to get bearings on how maybe to interact with this person who's caught kind of in a bubble. There's all sorts of strategies and things that you come up with, and ideas, and things are being discussed. But at a certain point, you start to recognize that the the way the person was brought up in the family unit always plays a role to how they're in some way vulnerable to whatever the cult is kind of selling. There's always a part of the pitch that appeals to the individual, and quite often that's related to something they've grown up with, or the way they were parented, or the way they think they're exposed to. And it's a really challenging conversation to have with the family, to say, are you willing to look at that part and aspect of this equation, in the sense, that what was your role? And not saying, that someone parented poorly, or they were a bad sibling or whatever, but just recognize that there are always elements that exist in any family that potentially play into someone's psyche, which may make them vulnerable to certain things that the group might be offering, or the culted person. And that's always challenging, because the family wants to just be focused on the person they're concerned, and is usually not as comfortable with recognizing this is also an opportunity for them to potentially self-reflect and look at themselves, and maybe you know um, alter some behavior that as I've said to many family, I said, if there were issues that existed in the family that might have contributed to the person wanting to kind of get away, so to speak, and those things get addressed when the person comes back, and the family's made some changes, that can have a profound effect on the person coming back into the family, a really positive effect. So, but a lot of times the family's like, no, 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 we're fine. We're worried about, our daughter or our son. And it's a challenging conversation. So I'm kind of curious what your experience has been with that, Jon.
Well, I could talk forever on that one, I think, and I probably will.
Yeah.
Probably will. I think my own example is a good starting point. I became interested in Scientology at 19, and
Hmm.
my mum, who was a leading light in the local conservative party, and
Right.
had been a councillor, a town councillor, and was an extraordinarily nice person. Um, and she did the really sensible thing. She went, "Oh, my son's got involved with this thing, and he's been through a little bit of emotional turmoil to lead him there. I'd better check it out." And she didn't tell me about this.
Mm.
She went to the Scientology place and she had a look at it.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was not it was not a brief journey. It was an hour or so to get there for her. And she thought it was weird, um, walking into a course room where people are going, "Off with his head," and stuff like that, which is a typical day in a Scientology. And "Do birds fly? Thank you." That kind of normal every day. Nobody shouted at ashtrays in the course room. You had to go out of the building to go and do that. But that's the famous thing. Anybody wants to watch, there's a video where Steve Hassan and I are there with Christian Sherko. And I think Chris Shelton's first recording, I think if anything, he'd done a couple of things before. So the eminent Chris Shelton, this was when he was
Right.
a baby ex-member back in 2015. It's on the channel here somewhere. But we go through these things and we do the thing in Scientology where you shout at an ashtray, which is everybody should do it. I learned a great deal from that. Sit down on that chair. Yeah, brilliant stuff. And so my mum went in, saw some of this goofy stuff, and went, "Okay, I'll do one of the courses. What harm can
Right.
it do?" So she did
Right.
one of the courses. Well, as they say, long story short, 8 years later, she left Scientology.
How many years?
8.
8. Wow.
So
Okay.
that's one parental approach. Go in, test it, see what it's like. She tested it and went, "Oh, this looks great. I'll do it." And we had almost independent careers in Scientology because I was
Wow. I didn't
down in the
realize
South, she
that.
was in
That's
the Midlands.
amazing. Wow.
And
Okay.
one day, um, I'd made a little bit of a stir, it appears. And one of her friends said to her, "What will you do if Jon's declared suppressive?" And I think people can work out what that means without me having to explain. And
Right.
and she said, "I'm leaving." She didn't say, "I will do this." She said, "The very thought that this organization might label my son a suppressive person, I'm done with it." And
Wow.
so that
Wow.
so there's route number one: go and try the cult for yourself, try it for a few years, and there you go. Route number two is the opposite of that, which is go and get every nasty piece of information you can about the cult and prove that your son, friend, grandma, or whoever's got involved is stupid. Prove to them they are stupid, which they'll doubtless accept because the cult is evil and wrong and bad. And you are an all knowing being and have understood that this one doesn't work either. I had an intervention where, and I haven't done the intervention since '95. I don't really
Right.
do anymore if anybody's worried about that. But we turned up and it was very confused that this lad had gone to the States. He was about to go up to a very prestigious university indeed. And he spent 9 days away
Mm.
and contacted his parents and said, I'm going to come home and explain to you why I've signed a 1,000 million year contract."
Right.
And when he walks in, his dad says, "Oh, you look so brainwashed when you got off the plane." And it's, "Oh, thanks. You just cost me 2 bloody hours of getting him back to where he was when he walked in the room. It was not
Oh
easy."
my.
So the parental disdain and this kind of stuff, and forget it. In between that is a way where you understand that you have to establish rapport, that if
Mm.
that's gone by the wayside, if you know this person needs to feel at ease with you. They need to be able to come and talk to you. They don't want to, any more than you want to lose face. They don't want
Right.
to lose face. So things have to be gentle. You don't criticize the cult. As you say, the dynamics of the family, good or bad, feed into this with a fundamental problem, which is that our society, virtually nothing is taught about authoritarian control and how it works.
Right,
And
exactly.
families often tend to be authoritarian. So you're moving from one cult to another. Adolescence in particular is a very vulnerable area. So I mean, one of the things like Free Domain Radio, Stefan Molyneux, and his divorcing from your family of origin, the idea that you can never be happy unless you exclude your family. I mean, there is a madness. But I met a woman some years ago, 10 years or so back, who told me that her 17-year-old had left a note on the pillow and gone, and she never heard from him again. So, and the guilt and the blame that comes with that, the idea, oh, I must have done something terribly wrong. Possibly. Right. I think the important thing in this conversation is it really isn't about right and wrong. It's about what does and doesn't work for people.
Exactly.
What will help them and what's not helpful. And understanding the family dynamics. If, I had another case where this guy, his whole life had been dominated by his father. His father was a very pushy, controlling person. He was not a bad person, as what I saw, but he wanted to be in charge, and he was incredibly willful. And this lad who was 25 when I saw him, he told a story of being a child and something had gone wrong with his bicycle. And rather than showing him how to fix it, his dad had taken it off and fixed it. And I think it was that kind of relationship that his dad was impatient, which was, I'm fairly impatient at times too, especially when bicycles come into the matter. I don't want to teach people how to mend bicycles, even though I have done it, I admit it. So that was weird, because while he was in Scientology, this young man maintained the relationship with his parents. After he left, and I was part of the intervention, after he left, he didn't speak to his father for 2 years.
Oh, right.
I think, then resolved that. I think that was part of it. But the family dynamic is, why am I searching for this thing? Why do I feel lost? Why am I a spiritual seeker? Why do I want to learn how to con people, or whatever the reasons are for joining such a group? That it does indicate that the family relationship is not strong enough. Maybe loving, but it's not strong enough. So the person is dissatisfied with life. And that, I don't want to get all Freudian or anything, but the attachment you have to your siblings, to your kids, to your parents, grandparents, those are the attachments upon which all of your attachments will be based. As my friend, my dear friend, you are my brother. You are an adopted sibling. You're somebody I'm saying, I will, go to the wire for this person because he's my friend. And I think that's what friendship is. Yeah. And it indicates that the attachment, the friendship within the family isn't working properly. And that the family can then learn to respond in a better way to one another. Yeah. And a lot of that is what I'm forcing you to do now. A lot of that is listening. A lot of that is letting the person express themselves fully and not contradicting them, opposing them, giving them evidence or what have you, letting them express themselves fully. And I think in many families that doesn't work. Probably the reason I talk so much is because I'm the youngest of four. I never had a chance when I was little.
Need to have yourself heard. Yeah. It really, what I really love about what you're saying is there's this opportunity when, anytime like a family dilemma emerges like this, like you feel you've lost someone to this cultic situation, whatever, and there's a crisis. obviously the tendency is to focus on the crises, but the opportunity at hand is to recognize that this is not happening in a vacuum, so to speak. You know, that the elements that like you've been referring to, there's always going to be family dynamics that contribute to why that person may have been seeking things in their life because they weren't having, there wasn't something foundationally in the family that would it could have been there where would have contributed to this feeling of lacking that they had, or seeking something out. And I think it's really challenging for a family to recognize that within that context, everyone played a role of some sort, and to take the time to say, well, what was my role, and whether it was conscious or unconscious or well-intentioned or not, how did that play a part? And is that something that I can maybe improve on in my own life so that even though the concentration is trying to get your loved one out, it's also an opportunity for your own personal growth and to be able to recognize that maybe this is an opportunity for me to kind of see my life differently in the way that I operate. And that's always something that I have, and it always isn't fair to say, but quite often people have a resistance to, because the focus wants to become a so-called victim. But I think, like anything I've learned in life, crises emerges as an opportunity for growth. And whether it's directed at ourselves individually or someone we care about, there's still an opportunity for some personal growth to occur. And I think that's where people miss the hidden opportunity, and sometimes resist, thinking it's not about them, it's just about the so-called person of concern, or the victim. And those are challenging conversations to have with families.
They are, and it is our nature to be embattled, to see things as polarized, black and white, right and wrong, good and
Right.
evil, light and dark. All of these simplistic ways of, and in fact, there are more than 50 shades of grey.
Yeah, great.
There are also 80,000, I'm told, 80,000 colors, tones, and hues that the human eye can recognize. So the subtlety that we're capable of is reduced to black and white, that's all that goes on, rather than focusing on growth or focusing on understanding or focusing on kindness, rather than taking some other emphasis. And psychologists call it the fundamental attribution error, because they don't know anything about communication. So what? And the fundamental attribution error is pretty much that I'm right and you're wrong. That my way. So you've got this thing: if I'm late for a meeting, it's because circumstances prevented me from arriving on time, and that's that. If you're late for the meeting, and I was late today, and I'm very sorry for that. And if you're late for the meeting, it's because you're a bad person and you hate me. That things, the telescope can, we are very defensive of ourselves, and that's understandable, because otherwise you end up being dependent upon somebody else to make your decisions for you. So finding that balance, it can be very difficult. But I was a great friend, Betty Tilden, who was just absolutely brilliant. She was the only psychiatrist in the UK who cared about cult members. And given that there are hundreds of thousands of cult members in the UK, that was good. And she spent her whole career, in her 70s by the time I met her, helping people, largely free of charge. And she said to me, I do hope that when you're talking to parents before an intervention, you don't do that awful thing that the Americans do. She was South African, by the way, so I'm not going to defend her in any way. That awful thing the Americans do, which is to tell them not to have any arguments, not to get angry. And I said, Betty, I do tell them that, but I do know that they won't follow my advice. And her point was that sometimes that moment of conflict, when it arises, can actually be helpful. But you do have to be rather careful. Sometimes the person who's been involved in the authoritarian cult will need to lose their temper. It will be helpful to them to finally say, and my thought in interventions was, I'm here to represent the member. I am not here to represent the family or whoever's, putting the bill. I'm here to represent the member, to explain their view and to help them, give them more information about the group than they have. But it was very interesting to see, the method of intervention when I came to it was like Alcoholics Anonymous. This is way back in the 1990s. Do you remember the 1990s? Such a long time ago, back in the last, when we were young people. The method that was put to me was like Alcoholics Anonymous. You get as many people as you can from this person's life to say, you're screwed up and you need help. So the first formal intervention I went on with Hannah and Jerry Whitfield in July 1991, an unforgettable experience. We had the father, the mother, the sister's boyfriend, Hannah, Jerry, me, 7 people, and this lad. Right. Seven of us, one of him. And I'm kind of going, so we're going to teach him Robert J. Lifton. Let's start with milieu control.
Yeah, which is what we have happening right at this moment. Yeah.
Yeah. And from there, I did another one with them and then kind of went, as on my own from then. And I sort of went, well, I'll take my assistant into the room, and her job, the eminent Bonnie Woods, who you met at the wedding. Yeah. And she's lovely. She's great. And she's really smart. But her job in an intervention was to realize that I was completely exhausted and tell a joke and make sure I could get a cup of tea.
Yeah.
But otherwise I would take in one family member or friend. That was it.
Yeah.
And start from the premise, your mum or whoever thinks you've been brainwashed into a cult. I'm here to help you explain the reality.
Yeah.
And I was. And but the family dynamics that you encounter, I was brought up to be trusting, to have a Christian view of the world. Even though by the time I got to Scientology, I was agnostic, from the age of 13. But I was brought up to love everybody and be nice to people, and that we're fundamentally not taught that there are predators in the world who will take you for everything you've got and then come back for more. That we're not taught anything about this. And so you can come to the situation by being like me and trusting everyone and wanting to be helpful and ameliorate all situations, make everything better. Or you can be wise. And it interests me that cult groups have a specific demographic usually. So in Scientology, you're largely dealing with, probably an average of 2 years higher education, middle class. There are different pockets of that. The super wealthy seem to be quite popular in Scientology for some reason. I don't know. Maybe religiously, Jesus was wrong about rich people in the kingdom of heaven. And maybe Ron Hubbard was trying to take all their money so they'd be able to get through the eye of the needle. Maybe we've got the wrong idea about him and he was really benevolent. But you can be too trusting or you can be too suspicious. And that too can be used against you. It's a matter of whether you're it's a matter of relationship. It's a matter of attachment and
I agree.
Of healthy skepticism towards the world and what's in it. When somebody I don't know comes at me and goes, "Oh, John, it's wonderful to see you." It's like, what are you selling? I'm sorry. It's just, if I don't know you, then you're selling me something, whether it's a concept or a product. So I think a huge part of it is the school system, and that we need to teach everybody in our society about this.
I completely concur. I think if we could give, I don't know, maybe around 12, 13, a basic course in critical thinking and coercive, and influence tactics and manipulation, just give people the fundamentals of how those things work, and kind of how we're kind of predisposed or kind of hardwired on a DNA level for certain survival approaches that if we're unaware of, we can be manipulated by, just the fact that we kind of just there's safety in numbers. So there's a part of us that just wants to follow, and it's very challenging to become a leader. We're much more instinctive to want to follow and to recognize that that can really be manipulated against all of us. I
Yeah.
mean, when I think back on my family dynamic, I mean, a lot of it was, my mother was a very um, controlling personality.
Mm,
I was one of six children. She was definitely, it was definitely a matriarchy in that sense. She kind of directed the approach of the parenting and the way it was all done, and it was kind of very much her way or the highway. And that sense of control, and that sense of trying to find my own individual voice out of a big family, like what it's like, um, contributed to the fact that when I met the cult leader and I met the group, I thought I was seeking out a form of independence. Like I was,
mm,
getting myself away from a controlling situation into one that I would be able to make my own path and forge my own kind of frontier, so to speak, and not recognizing that all I did was kind of replicate a worse version of what I had in my family, and it took me 20 years to figure that out. But at the time, I was processing like, oh, I'm doing my own thing. I'm creating my own independence. I'm going to go, forge my path, on my own. And it's so interesting that if you don't even understand your own family dynamics, because I really didn't at that time. It's
mm,
just what I grew up with. And in many ways, my mother was always telling me what to do, and I was usually not performing exactly to what she expected. So it was always a matter of like doing my best, and I could always do better, and putting forward effort and being told I could always improve. And so when I got into the cultic situation, it was a very similar thing of people telling me what to do and that I should be doing it better and working harder and all, and that's all I knew. So that was familiar. That didn't set off any sort of red flag. And when I look back on it now, and I've done a lot of work in trying to understand what were those dynamics that led, like, even doing my mother's backstory and figuring out like why was she so controlling, and
mm,
it all came from some wounds that she experienced early in her life where she felt abandoned by her father, and her mother, died when she was quite young from cancer, and so she had all sorts of abandonment issues,
mm,
and the control was just a means to try to not experience that loss again. And obviously it wasn't necessarily healthy, but when you understand what goes on, you can kind of let go of some of that resentment. But it's like within our family dynamic, I don't know how, I've got a sibling who's really looked into it and really gained a lot of perspective, and we're very, very close. And it's because he saw that opportunity when this thing happened, that he recognized that he had misjudged the situation, and he was
mm,
trying to rectify it from the point of view of getting himself educated and find out what did my brother really get himself involved in. I thought it was fine, it was safe. I now recognize it's dangerous. How did I miss that? What happened? How does these things work? And it's led to us to have a really profound and strong relationship. And then the other siblings and my father, who have done lesser at that, it's there's a missed opportunity in my opinion. I
mm.
think these situations we can all learn from, but everyone's got to take some accountability for the role they played, and that's where people push back.
Yeah. And I mean, are your mum and dad still with us, or?
Now, my dad's still with us. My mother's
Yeah.
passed on. Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I mean, what was your father's part in this, do you think?
My dad was, largely under her control as well. So he kind of took a secondary position. I mean, I think he he was always very concerned, but not felt there was no way to be proactive about it. And the fact that he never really kind of did the research to understand what it was, he just labeled it as bad.
Mm,
Um, Even though I've done all this work, obviously within the kind of cult survivor community, and trying to impart information, it's not, conversations that we have not been able to have because he just wants to put it in the rearview mirror, and he's just so thankful to have me back, and so thankful to have the family unit back together, that it just, those things just kind of do not get addressed, you
Mm.
know. But he's a great man and a really good-hearted person. I don't think he's capable of telling a lie, which I don't know how you get through life that way, but he's just one of those kind of
Mm.
good two shoes who just is always, he gets himself in trouble, but he always, is honest about everything.
Mm.
And I have a deep admiration for him. But in this area of psychology, this is where his home, he was a child of an alcoholic. So he's emotionally crippled from the point of view that he's got an emotional nature, but he can't process it very well, and he certainly can't talk about it very well.
Mm.
So that's where there's a sticking point. But
And it belongs to that generation as well, doesn't it? That
yes, yes,
um, my dad, he apologized to me a few months before he died. He said, "I'm sorry that I never spent any time with you when you were a child, but I couldn't deal with the world." And he'd had
right,
the Dunkirk experience and the Normandy experience, and
right.
he was there at the relief of Belsen. Um, on top of which, his childhood was like, you were absolutely kidding me. That his mother was a terrible narcissist, awful,
Now,
awful woman, um, who had pretty much failed at everything in life, as such people often do. But she was just utterly, utterly selfish. His father had abandoned them when he was 10 years old, so he got you know plenty of reason to do this.
mm,
But along the way, you see, I couldn't remember, we never played soccer together. I don't remember playing any game ever together. We didn't play chess, we didn't
right, right.
cards, we didn't do anything together because he was overwhelmed by the world and worked himself to death, maintaining, well, 4 children, kind of.
Yeah, sure.
Um, and, but that, that connection, that lack of a connection. I later, one of my brothers said to me, until you were 5 years old, he was all over you. He just
Mm,
absolutely, you'd be on his knee, and then you got to be five, and it was like, no. And I think that in that generation, there was a very strange idea about the relationship between men, that if a father was loving, you might be gay. This
oh,
would kind of,
wow.
and I
Yeah,
think that the Second World War generation, that there was these rigid ideas
mhm,
about this, and um, I think it's probably more the opposite would be true if it was going to have any influence. That
yeah,
if you felt rejected by your father, maybe, I don't know. I don't go for any of that Freudian nonsense, as you know.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I, but I think there was a kind of fear about affection towards boys, and of course now we hug each other, and that's very nice.
yeah.
Um, but that can be a tension within a family. How much hugging happens?
I think,
My mum would always hug us, and my
yeah.
dad would not. He learned. I was about 30 by the time he did, but he did learn.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't remember a ton of hugging going on in our family. Yeah, my dad, I do remember, and it's interesting the point you bring up, because my older brother's 2 years older than me, so we were a pair. My dad said, if he'd give us $1 for any day we didn't fight, and we never made a nickel. I mean, we just, cats and dogs the whole way through. But um, he would come in at night at a certain time when we were young, and he would sing old railroad songs, and he would scratch our backs. And I remember
oh,
loving that. Like, just that was such an important part. And at some point that stopped.
mm,
And then it just all stopped. Like, there was virtually no contact, physical contact. And I don't remember what the break, the age was when it stopped. But then it was really not until it was actually, I think, when I was just getting involved with the cult in my 20s, that I tried to force my dad to give me a hug one time. I think it was around when I was graduating university and that sort of thing. Because everyone was very huggy and very, touchy in the cult, and so I was trying to break through that whole thing. And I got met with the very stiff back. But now, over decades, now my dad, when I see him, I hug him and he hugs back, and
mm,
we've made progress. It's interesting you bring up the hugging thing. I think that is a very important component, because I certainly know that was something that was very addictive to me when I got involved with the group. We were the kind of the new age, and everyone's like, "Oh, I love you," and the hugs and the whole thing. And that was like mainlining, something
Mm.
that I hadn't really felt growing up at home. And that's an aspect to consider. I mean, that's interesting you raised that point.
And you say, as we can list it as a vulnerability that there was
Mhm.
something that nurturing that
Mm.
you were not getting. And um, of course, if one is, you see, I didn't have to reject my family, even though Scientology is notorious for the policy
Right.
of disconnection and shunning. Um, it was, I was involved for 9 years, and it was only in the 6 months before I left when it was suggested to me that I shouldn't talk to my good friend Arachela. And I
Right.
said, no, I'm not doing, don't care what
Yeah.
you think. Um, and that, so, my relationship with my family was fine, except for, I will bring up one instance that we went to some kind of family party, and my oldest brother had booked a pub, and so
Mm.
I don't know how many of us, there were probably 14 or 15 of us there. When you've got 4 kids and they have kids, you just get, well, ridiculous amounts of people. And my then wife and I were sat at the far end of the table, and down both sides of the table, newspaper clippings about Scientology were passed from my brother down the table. So everybody got to read them. And this was at the point, it was 81 probably, where,
Right.
of course, 11 Scientologists, including L. Ron Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, were sent to prison for kidnapping, false imprisonment, bugging, burglary, breaking into government offices, forging government credentials, and massive theft of government documents. Typical, trivial, everyday matters, But this
Right.
had got into the Guardian newspaper or something in the UK, and they passed these things down the table, and we got them last.
Mm.
And that was a real cold water shock.
Yeah.
It was not in any way persuasive, being ridiculed and humiliated in this way. And I think that is a part of mending the relationships that um, praise in public, reprimand in private. Hip rip,
Right.
praise in public, reprimand in private. Uh, it's apparently a school mantra here that teachers ignore completely, in my experience. And I
Yeah.
think there's a lot to that in a family, if you learn how to take somebody aside, if you want to talk about something negative, rather than it being, we will shame you into compliance, which was, I think,
Right.
my brother probably thought it was funny, bless him. Um, and we're fine now. But that the attitude of mind of is like my mum used to reckon. She'd grown up in Nottingham, where I am now, and moved to 40 miles away, which she hated because she loved her wonderful family. I loved them too. They were marvelous people. But she used
Right.
to say that in Nottingham, people don't have an accent. They talk properly.
Okay.
And then she moved back here, age 70 something, and went, oh dear, laters, you know. But that sense that my culture is normal
Yeah.
and your culture is weird. And that kind of thing about when somebody joins a group, inevitably they're moving into another culture. This is not because they're
Right.
really happy with their lives and everything's going swimmingly well. It's generally because they feel the need for a different culture, a different way of being.
Exactly.
And it will be foreign to the family. It'll be, wrong. Maybe they don't wear shoes, or they do something outrageous like that, they wear a little
Well, they
rosary.
only, they only eat vegetarian foods. Yes.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
there. Now we're getting to the truth of it. And uh, so accommodating strangeness for a family
Mm.
and going, yeah, that's okay. I mean, again, my family was so tolerant and kind. When I was 11 years old and said to my mom, I don't want to go to church on a Sunday morning, she said, okay. And there was no further conversation. And if she'd had the conversation, I was 11 years old. If she'd had
Yeah.
the conversation, I would have explained that I was tired out from having to get up 5 days a week to go to school, I'd started sleeping in on a Saturday morning and I wanted to sleep in on Sunday morning. I would have gone to Evensong. But that sort of thing of being able to have a conversation and say, well, why?
Yeah.
But being able to say why without it being a challenge, and somebody being able to explain themselves. I have little rituals with that are to do with people involved in cults, and one of them is, first of all, you have to be in a nice place where they're willing to talk to you. There needs to be a rapport where they feel comfortable about talking to you. But there are questions like, what was it that attracted you? And how many families actually ask that? And then what do you expect to achieve? What have you seen other people achieve, with no comeback on it? No kind of, well, I told you that, or what have you. Just let them explain themselves, because the most important thing is that the process of thought happen in their head, not that they, there's a line in Downton Abbey where the butler, Jim Carter, wonderful actor, says, but sir, I wanted to be convinced, not defeated. And that's a lesson for anybody involved in this, that it is not about proing, it's not about you being the one with the swollen chest and dictating the terms to everybody. It's about having an equality in communication, so that people can say on. The other thing I got to, let me let you comment on that first. Sorry.
Well, I think what's interesting about that is you have to recognize that the individual was finding something in the relationship or the group dynamic that they felt compensated something that they were looking for in their life. Either they weren't experiencing it at home, but they weren't experiencing it somewhere else. And so I think that inquiry of what made it appealing to you, and trying to hear in their own words what they found that got them excited, or what they found that they weren't sure could exist because they hadn't felt it up until then, and then they felt it within this context. Those are such important things that I understand, like what were the hooks, what were, and it's not in any way attacking. You're just trying to understand what was the process, how did it unfold, it's the analogy we always use in our field is how to boil a frog, right? It's like,
though having never tried that, I am told it is mythological. But
is that mythological? But
I keep going and looking at the frogs in my pond and thinking I could just drop one of them in some water,
Yeah. But I think
I can't find a better analogy.
It comes from that point of view of recognizing it is, the grooming process is incremental, and the more that, I think, and this is also the problem you have with even telling these stories within the media. Very often within that grooming process and that incremental process, there's information being imparted to you that all sounds quite kind of docile, and not, overly kind of, out there or crazy. But within that incremental process, you get to the point where you get into the kind of the more extreme and crazy, things you would label as more crazy way of thinking. And then when the story gets told, it's like, well, how did you ended up believing this, and this, and you don't, without showing that process of how you get there, you lose all sense of empathy or relatability to how you can get to that mindset. It's like Nazi Germany didn't happen overnight. It was an incremental thing of, they got more and more extreme over time. And it's not like what people were signing up for in the beginning was anything absolutely, ludicrous. It just evolves, like all these sort of things. So I think that's such a great entry point, is let the person in their own words explain that process of what were kind of the bigger oversweeping, idealistic type stuff that kind of maybe hooked you in, and then it gets continually refined, and through that grooming process, I certainly know in our group, we were provided information as a reward. So even though the so-called information you can look at out of context and say, well, that's ludicrous, like that makes no sense at all, because it was presented as a reward, it was less about the content and more about just receiving the information as an achievement.
Yeah,
And
a kind of initiation, achieving a higher level, a
exactly.
gnosis that you're being given, which is so many groups. I mean, Scientology, of course, has a layered.
Exactly. Scientology is all about those type of tiers.
Hmm.
And so and I think that's why it's such a valuable process to let the person in their own words try, as best they can to relay what that process looked like for them to kind of get kind of seduced into the group or
And
the relationship.
on the one hand, it increases, their families understanding what happened to them. But I think more importantly, I find that when I have to articulate something, I find out how stupid I am. That something that seems absolutely obvious to me, I'll then try and explain it to somebody and realize it's a heck of a lot more complicated than I thought.
Right.
And
Right.
so having the thought put in your head, the little seed put in your head, what is it I'm trying to achieve?
Mm.
And realizing 5, 10, 20 years later, however long it is, that you haven't achieved it.
Yeah.
And there is an aspect of this that let's first of all look at the idea of normalcy, that you are now believing all these wacko cult things, okay? And
Yeah.
how did that happen? Well, I worked with a group called Churches Together in East Grinstead for 2 years, and together was the wrong word. Untogether would have been better, because
Yeah.
the Catholic priest wouldn't be in the same room as the Baptists. The Baptist didn't mind being in the same room as the Catholic priest, but he was the agent of the devil. And so I had to have 2 sets of meetings because of this.
Right.
And one of the Baptist ministers, he looked at me and he said, do these people really believe that the evil Prince Xenu, 75 million years ago, shipped the inhabitants of 176 planets to the Earth and had their souls blown up in volcanoes with hydrogen bombs and clusters together? I probably giving a bit more detail than he did, but
Right.
it's a
Right.
funny story, and anybody that hears that story will be dead within 2 days, by the way. So I'm sorry about that, Hoyt, according to the great Ron Hubbard.
That's
So
right. That's right.
this Baptist minister says this thing about Xenu and the body thetans, and I couldn't help myself. I talk too much. What can I say? So I looked at him and said, look, there are people who believe there was once a bloke who could not only walk on water, but turn it into wine. And then I realized who I was talking to. And I've heard this thing about people's face going red. I'd never
Mm.
seen it before. It's like, whoa.
Until
And
then,
I
wow.
had to go, oh, I'm so sorry. No, but there's the reality that, and when atheists come along and tell me that they know the truth, it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, really. And what is that? Oh, it's the Big Bang. The Big Bang. Okay. So what you're telling me is an 11-dimensional P membrane collapsed. And they look at me and go, sorry. I go, an 11-dimensional P membrane collapsed. That's the Big Bang, isn't it? It was an 11-dimensional P membrane, wasn't it? And they're going, commonly known as a brain in physics, spelled BRANE. And they're kind of, what are you talking about? And I'm going, so the priest says it was God, and the scientist says it was the Big Bang. Have you read Stephen Hawking's proof, mathematical proof of the Big Bang? And they usually, so far, say no.
Right.
They're not willing to accept that it's a belief, however, because it's scientific. Now, I'm very pro-science. I'm so pro-science that I disagree with this idea that, because that's our best idea at the moment. And by the way,
Right.
there is an argument that 11-dimensional P membrane was a part of a steady state and that once the Gnab Gib, which is the reverse of the Big Bang, has happened,
Right.
it'll all happen again, and it'll just keep on happening. So that's not really told me anything about why it's happening, about where it came from, about what's going on. But people accept that as happily as they accept the idea of God the creator or
Yeah.
whatever. And as one of my brothers who is an atheist, and he had the kind of Richard Dawkins attitude, a little bit
Right.
militant, a little bit sky fairies and this kind of, putting people down. And then he's a very, very smart guy. And one day said, that's my metaphor. You can have your metaphor. And realizing that in fact it's Terry Pratchett, that the world is on the back of um, 4 elephants that are on a turtle shell. That's what supports the planet Earth, and that's
Oh,
true. That's absolutely true. That is. But if somebody sees it a certain way, then for them it is that way. Being able to let go of that strangeness has come into the
yeah.
world, and I don't mean strangeness, the subatomic particle here. I mean actual strangeness. That how could you believe these stupid things? Well, that gives us the premise that what you believe is perfectly sensible. and
Right. Exactly.
no.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think it's really an issue of recognizing that any or most belief systems out of when taken to their just out of context, some of them just sound completely ludicrous,
All of
and
them sound completely
yeah, yeah,
ludicrous. The truth sounds completely
and
ludicrous.
so
When you
and
look at the
so
way a
to
cell works in
and
the
to
human
so to
body.
say like my form of crazy is more legitimate because yours is definitely
Mm,
crazy. It's just it's just it's hilarious to me because it's just different versions of the same thing, and
mm,
ultimately what I guess the question really comes down to is like what really matters to you? Like this whole idea, I think, of having to be right is such a trap, right? This idea of figuring it all out also, I think, can be a trap.
mm,
I think the wonder of not knowing and the confidence of knowing you'll know enough to get through whatever you're facing, but this drive to try to figure it all out so I can be in a position where I can say you're wrong and I'm right. I mean, what is I just don't see the purpose behind that. I don't see how anyone really benefits from that situation.
mm.
You
Yeah,
know?
I think it's really important. I know a surgeon who is an atheist, and his wife's a Roman Catholic, and they've had a successful marriage, and I can't
Right.
figure that at all. It's like, my wife Pamela and I, we sing from that same hymn sheet pretty much. We don't know
Yeah.
what's going on, and we're having such a great time that we don't want to worry
Yeah,
ourselves quite
and
with
you
it.
don't have to. I mean, I really try to look at it as Earth school. I mean,
Yeah.
I think one of the traps of my culture group, having this doomsday kind of approach and all these sort of things, it was all built on the primary premise that something's wrong with the world.
Mm,
That look at what's going on, things, and it's our job to so-called fix it.
mm,
And that is such a delusional point of view, I can say now. But at the time, I thought like it's not that hard to take anyone's point of view and apply it to the world and say, oh, there's some things that are really seem to be off base, and there's
mm,
atrocities happening, there's
mm,
war, there's all sorts of terrible things. So you can say, oh, it's all something needs to change. But I think the important thing is to just have a point of view. Like when I look at it from Earth School, it's like if I can just accept that the world is the school is exactly the way it's supposed to be for me to learn the most. So it's not about it being wrong or that something's broken that needs to be
mm,
fixed. It's about it being in a certain way that it registers certain maybe emotional reactions from me where I wish things were different, or I wish
mm,
they could be something alternatively to what I'm perceiving, because that allows me to build like a moral compass to try to make my way through the world. But to definitively say, I know this needs to change and this is the way it should be,
mm,
boy, I think that's some thin ice to walk on. But that's kind of the ground that the cults kind of build themselves on. It's like we have the answers. This is what's going on. This is what's wrong, and this is how we fix it.
mm.
And I think that's just such a trap.
Yeah, and I think we can agree that there are certain things that are wrong with the world,
Mm.
and people being horrid and unpleasant to each other, for example, is not a good thing. And the problem is that within authoritarian systems, people are horrid and unpleasant to each other to make the world a better place. And I have this as I said at the beginning of the conversation, I'm reading a book on Jewish apocalyptic literature, which everybody ought to read. It's stunning. It is actually stunning. The guy writing it is John J. Collins, absolute genius and the
Wow.
leader in his field. But what took me to this is the realization that you're in studying, oh, here it goes, Charles Manson. In
Right.
studying Charles Manson, one of the essential threads of his group is the book of Revelation. And I finally read it. It's only 24 pages. I don't know why it's taken me so long, but I finally read it last year because I needed to read it.
Right.
And, I know what was in it, and I know it's what inspired Ron Hubbard as well. And I'm kind of going, oh, this end days thing, this is really quite interesting. And then you kind of go, well, probably the Iraq wars were caused by end days Christians going, we've got to go and do this. Oh, the state of Israel and Zionism comes from it doesn't have a Jewish origin. Zionism started in 1620 among English Puritans. It took more than 200, it was about 250 years before anybody Jewish was persuaded that going back to Zion, or Jerusalem as we
really?
call it.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. And the idea in the 1930s, the British military high command ordered Ord Wingate, who was one of my childhood heroes because he was the head of the Chindits in Burma, the bravest of people who went to fight the Japanese in the jungles in Burma. And really horrific. And Wingate was a great hero. I didn't know what he was doing before that. I didn't know he was a member of the Plymouth Brethren, a group that believes that until all the Jews go back to Jerusalem, Jesus won't come back. And so Alexander Wavell, the head of the British military in the Middle East, which was very extensive at that time with the occupation of most of the Middle East after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So Egypt, from Egypt right through to the edge of Turkey is under the control of the British and the French, Saudi Arabia, all of the Arab states. So you've got a serious military presence, and Wavell dispatches Ord Wingate to Palestine to train. I don't know if he trained just Haganah or just Irgun or both of the terrorist groups that represented Jewish settlers there. Some of the Jewish settlers there, I should say, not all of them by a long chalk. And he trained them in blowing things up and killing people and how you do that.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. There are now all over Israel, you see Vingate Street in his honor. So you get this, because Jesus won't come back until, we've got to do this. And I start then looking at end days and going, actually, the Crusades, I read about them many years ago, 40 years ago, and it really helped me to leave Scientology and the kind of fanaticism that I was seeing around me, to see these awful, terrible things that had happened in the name of, Jesus is going to be here. He's going to be here soon.
Right. Exactly.
And now, this only got me the other week. I was talking with a guy, these two guys that I just met, retired and extraordinarily smart. And they'd been members of the Labour Party here, striving for equality and, get rid of the pariah rich people who prey upon us and all of that stuff. They'd been convinced, absolutely good people. And we all lost hope under Tony Blair and New Labour in any kind of solution for anything, frankly, in the end. We got the Iraq War instead. But he was telling me really that he has no hope for the human future, one of these guys. And I realized that so many of the people I talk with, that's what they really feel, that Climageddon, as my friend Lawrence Wollersheim puts it, is upon us, and there's no turning back, and humanity is screwed. And I'm kind of going, oh, this is another kind of end days, isn't it? This is like,
exactly.
We're now in climate end days. And of course, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do our best to make sure that Jesus wants to come back. But you've also got this other dynamic, which is the Christian community saying, well, Jesus will come back and sort it all. All the landfill can go to Turkey. Oh, it already is doing. The poor people in Africa can pick through all of the waste dumps and all that stuff, and that will all be good. That it's a mentality. And in dealing with cultism, we're dealing with a particular mentality, which will usually have some kind of end days aspect to it, that's saying, in Scientology, we'd have ominous warnings. It's like, one of my favorites was Ron Hubbard's going, I want Scientologists to survive World War III. And he wrote a book in the 50s called All About Radiation, which is about how scared we all ought to be. And he also wrote that if you arouse fear in people, you can control them. And he specifically said the fear of nuclear war is a means of controlling people. And then he used it, which is fairly typical for cult leaders. But to bring about that panic, to bring about that sense of strangeness, to bring about the sense that you are the only people that can do anything about it. We knew we
Yeah.
could clear the planet and that nobody else could do it. And
Well, and I also think the doomsday scenarios, it creates a ticking clock. It tells you like, oh, there's only X amount of years left before the shit's going to hit the fan. So you better get your act together. And we're the conduit for you to do that. So it's a very effective technique to kind of raise the stakes and basically to the individual you're addressing, it's like, are you going to be part of the problem? Or are you going to be part of the solution? Shit or get off the pot. And it's a very powerful influence technique to have that kind of doomsday scenario play into the picture.
yeah, and it's all the way through our culture, from the thousands of catastrophe novels,
Right.
through to, it was about
Yeah.
1972, wasn't it? David Bowie, 5 years. That's all we've got. 5 years.
Yeah.
It's not a lot. His lyrical abilities did improve thereafter. But curiously enough, there's a Scientology thing called 5 years, saying
Right.
optimistically there's only 5 years left or something. This was in, I think, 1963. And he wasn't being very optimistic. There's a point towards the end. I interviewed somebody who was on Scientology's watchdog committee.
Oh,
At that
right.
time, there were 14 people, and they took Hubbard's orders and controlled the 40,000 Scientologists or what have you. And this young man who'd been on it told me they got an order from Hubbard one day. This had been in 81, I think. Yeah, 81.
Mhm.
This order came from Hubbard saying, I'm sorry, I can't save everyone. It's too late. I can just save the people in this room, and you'll have to tell everybody else that it's all going to be okay. But you're the only people I can save, you
Wow.
14. And he didn't.
Remarkably, yeah. Remarkably, it didn't come true. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean, with our group, it was all, going to happen around the millennium. Clearly, it did not happen. So I'm always curious for all these people who are largely unrecovered and not dealing with, what happened. I wonder how they process, that the doomsday never happened. We're now 25 years down the road. How do you make peace with? Yeah, I
Well,
have no
it,
idea how
it's
they.
the basis of Leon Festinger's idea of cognitive dissonance, isn't he? That
Yeah,
he
yeah, right.
shortly after he'd come up with it, you get this When Prophecy Fails, which I think is a must read. I think it's a brilliant
Yeah,
book. And he infiltrates two people into a sect, the Santander or Santananda. I can't remember whether
yeah,
it's a Spanish bank or an alien
right.
being. It's one of the two. Um, this woman, Marion Keach, is getting these messages, and
Mm,
he puts two people in the group, and he predicts that those people who go to the hilltop for the mothership to escape the Earth will
right.
keep believing. Those people who don't go to the hilltop will walk away. And oh dear, do we see this happening? That when the failure becomes the greatest justification, you see, it's because we prayed that it didn't happen. So,
Yeah,
it's like with
exactly.
transcendental meditation, the Berlin Wall came down because we meditated. And you've got that
Yeah,
wonderful study that they put forward that proves how effective transcendental meditation is, because the crime rate in New York went down after they'd meditated and prayed for this to happen. They don't point out that, in fact, they've misreported the statistics and the murder rate went up while they were
oh,
meditating.
jeez.
But
Oh my
let's
goodness.
not confuse science with things. I I used to recommend that there are various things I used to recommend that people would never do. So I would always say watch Life of Brian.
Which
If
I
if you've
love. Yeah,
got
yeah.
somebody in a cult, watch Life of Brian, because it says everything you need to know about cults, I think. Follow the gourd. No, follow the shoe. He's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. Um, but it really is, I think it is a very intelligent approach to the problem. I really do. I don't think I ever convinced anybody to watch it. The other movie was Leap of Faith with Steve
Oh,
Martin and Deborah
Steve
Winger.
Martin. Yeah, yeah.
And it shows you how so many of the tricks are done.
Mm,
Like when he he talks the cop out of giving them a speeding ticket,
Hmm.
by finding, oh, there's a violin case there. That must be your kids. Are you estranged from your family? And he talks the cop through it so he doesn't get a ticket. And this the great one that LaRouche's do, which is you call on people's houses and you say, "Oh, could I just go to your bathroom?" And in the
Right.
bathroom, you make a careful note of all the medicines, the name of the people, and then at the meeting
Right.
later on, you can say, "There's somebody in the audience who's suffering from cancer of the kidneys,"
Oh, right, right, right.
and then you
Yeah.
name them. And all of these awful tricks that are used. I think having some sense of that. The other thing I used to say to people was, I think it'd be good if you understood what Scientology is. And
Yeah.
the resistance to that, I'm not reading anything that Hubbard wrote. And it's sort
Yeah.
of, okay.
Yeah.
And
Then how do you know what we're talking about? Yeah.
yeah. And, I had a case where um, it would have been possible for this parent to actually feed information, give information, which
Right.
might stimulate thinking.
Yeah.
And I'm very much, when Steve Hassan, who's still involved in the intervention business, I think,
Mhm.
but he put forward this idea of the family doing the right things to prepare the ground. I think it's in Freedom of Mind. So
Right.
I actually edited it, so I ought to remember it, but it was a long time ago. Um, and so he has a strategic intervention or something he calls it.
Mhm.
That, and I think that's very valuable. That if you have somebody who's in a cult, an authoritarian cult, you need to understand that landscape and
Yeah,
how that
exactly.
works. I would hopefully sell a couple of my own books at this point. Um, Hopefully, opening our minds
Yeah.
gives some sort of overview of not just this is what cults do, but as Margaret Singer says, these are the cults in our midst.
Yes,
You know,
exactly. That's a
that
great book. Yeah.
yeah, that we're
Yeah.
in all of our beliefs. We're just in Istanbul. What a wonderful place! I really didn't expect it to be. It blew me
Oh,
away,
wow. Yeah, it's
and
beautiful. Yeah.
everybody should go there. But we're in the Hippodrome, and you've got the Hagia Sophia, the world's fourth largest church and one
Right.
of the older ones, and on one end, and you've got the Blue Mosque, just one of the most beautiful. The inside there is just absolutely wonderful, the great big elephant
Right.
columns and all that. But in the Hippodrome, you're reminded this is where the Roman Empire moved
Mm.
in 324 AD, and it was their center, the imperial center, until 1453 when the Turks
Wow.
finally took it, and a massive power in the world. And you're at the Hippodrome, you're at the site of riots that happened between the Blues and the Greens, the two sides of the fan clubs for the charioteers.
Right.
And those riots led to an attempt to overthrow the emperor. And we are told in the literature I read there, about 10,000 people die in this fan club riot. And I would
Wow.
assess that here we are, Trump versus Biden. In this
Right.
country, Keir Starmer
Yeah.
versus Rishi Sunak. That you're with us or you're against us, as George W. Bush said at the beginning of the Iraq War.
Right.
Um, that that polarization is fundamental to the way we behave, and
Yes.
it is
Yeah.
so childish. It is so unintelligent to be that way, rather than saying "Vive la différence," as the French aren't actually talking about this particular thing at that point. They're talking about men and women, but let's celebrate difference. Let's celebrate
Yeah.
diversity and difference, and in belief as well, while not losing our ethical compass. It would worry me if
Yeah.
um, the Jehovah's Witnesses were pulled into the groups that the Anglicans talk to, but they probably are by now. Who knows? But
Yeah.
that we have to allow for differences of opinion, um, and so yeah. And the final thing on my list is transcendent experience.
Hmm.
That what will have pinned somebody to the group is usually an unusual experience. Something has happened to them. And in
Right.
Scientology, I used to, for years after I left, I'd say to people, what was it and this is something you can ask, but you really have to sit back on the answer and not say a word.
Right.
What was it that convinced you it was true? And it was always an experience. It was always they were sat
Well,
staring at somebody and they suddenly
right.
something happened.
Very often the awe experience, right?
This is
Yeah.
exactly where we're going.
Yeah.
Yuval. I
Yeah.
pointed out to Yuval the other week that his name is La Or,
A lot.
and he
Oh,
was La
yeah.
Or, and he was yeah. And it's like you teach about or, and your name is La, French word for the or.
Oh,
And he
how
was, I don't
interesting.
know what you're talking about, and and so
Couldn't
it
hear
goes
the
on.
sound. Yeah.
But
Oh, yeah. No,
that
I mean
and how are
that
you accepting that the person that you're
exactly,
dealing with has had what they consider to be a transcendent experience? Now,
exactly.
I've just with Steve Hassan, we just finished a chapter that should be coming out in a book called Psychiatry and Eastern Religions and Spirituality. And I think there are
Okay.
a number of authors who wanted to exclude our chapter because in it I give a list of the things you can do that will make you have an
Right.
experience, and they're
Right.
all physiological. You know, if you fast, if you go without sleep, if you rock backwards and forwards, if you chant, if you play drums, if you stare at something, if you
Right.
hyperventilate like the
Right. Right.
Rajneeshis,
Right.
these things will bring about an experience which will then be labeled
That's
transcendent.
that's transcendent.
In
Exactly.
fact,
Yeah. Yeah.
but so remembering that that's gone on as well when you're dealing with a person, and it's finally on that point, what they feel has benefited them in the group, it's up to them to decide. So trying to persuade somebody that their experience was worthless is a bad way to go.
No, I agree. Not the way to do it. No. But and to bring it back full circle, I think, like I said, in these situations where someone is caught in this in a cultic environment, the family has the opportunity to really reflect on the role that they played, and are there things that they can address personally to learn from, that they, maybe could do things differently going forward. I think that's, an invaluable opportunity to recognize, even though our focus is upon this person who's caught in the situation, I have an opportunity for my own personal growth as well to take the 10,000 square foot view and look at kind of what was my role, and how can I learn from the role I played, and is there a role that I would prefer to have going forward that's different than what I've done in the past.
Yes, absolutely. And how can we improve our relationship? And the textbook for me would be Eric Fromm, The Art of
Right.
Loving. And I think for anybody who's involved in, a disaster, a crisis in relationship,
Yeah.
that is a great textbook.
Yeah.
I am going to take issue with Eric Fromm. He does in one of his books suggest that homosexuality is a psychiatric disorder, which was the common belief. I think it's 1993, so he died, I think, in 1982, somewhere around there.
Mhm.
So it didn't leave the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual until after he was dead. But it was a stupid idea, and
Yeah.
it's been commented on before when I've mentioned Fromm, and quite rightly, that's a stupid idea. But The Art of Loving is really sensible approach to how can I be in better relationships with people.
Mm.
And this simple idea that he puts that we think that love will just happen to us, that we'll feel love. And I think love in this sense, it's not just romantic love, that I think we can take it down to all of our attachments and affections. And he says it's rather like, you're a painter, and when you see the subject that you want to paint, you'll know how to paint.
Yeah.
And it is
Yeah.
best to learn how to do it. And love and relationship are things that we can definitely learn about. So The Art of Loving, Eric Fromm, definitely
Yeah.
a good textbook for this circumstance, and one that's not only already on your list, but you've probably already read it.
Yeah. I've got
Yeah,
it I've got it in my Kindle. It's a
yeah,
great book. Yeah.
it is. I just
Yeah.
just read To Have or to Be, which was his last, the last in this whole series of books. It's the 7th Eric Fromm book I've read over the years. That's
Wow.
really, and and that just blew my mind, but it's not really directly relevant to this conversation. So I just thought I'd put it in there because,
Okay, well, yeah. Listen, like I said, you're always the unending resource of book reading, so it's good to have them. Sure.
Yeah, it surprises me. People think I'm immensely well read. There's this kind of myth, and I'm just immensely lucky. I read. It takes me a couple of weeks to get through a book at the time I have set for it. So I read about 25 books a year, and I now and of course watch documentaries and stuff. I
Right.
watched this wonderful thing about the endocrine system last night. Who'd have thought? It's
I was
endlessly
watching
fascinating.
a very interesting one on Netflix about the Neanderthals, which is interesting.
Yeah, aren't they
Yeah.
though? I just this week in New Scientist there was a reconstruction of a Neanderthal woman's face because you can
Wow.
do that from
Right.
forensic people do it, and it did make me wonder why we have Neanderthal genes, but
Yeah, we do. We do.
we do.
I think I've got 2 or 3%, when I did my test.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
yeah.
I must say I'm skeptical of these gene tests. I really must, because you'd have to know. I mean, with Neanderthals, possibly, but a lot of it's like, well, you've got genes that come from this part of the world or that part of the world. And it's like, well, have you got samples that go back in
Yeah,
time long enough to test these against? But
exactly. I think I agree. I think it's a bit tough to be definitive that this is exactly accurate. I think it's hard. Best
But
guess.
the sense that we've been mixed and matched, I think is, I think is really useful. But don't say it to white supremacists because they'll get upset with you.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, always
Well,
good to see you, John.
yeah, always a pleasure, Hoyt. Always a pleasure. I would say I look at the week on Sunday. I try and
Yeah.
remember to look at my diary, and I didn't think I got anybody today. And when
Yeah.
I saw it as you, I was so pleased.
Well, good.
That's got to be a good thing, hasn't it?
It's been too long, so it's good to see you.
Yeah. Well, thanks to everybody for the 7 or 8 people who've managed to get through all of this.
Yeah, that's right.
And if you want to put into the comments, John, you talk too much. I know that.
All right.
I already know that. And it's been grand. And
All right.
thank you very much, Hoyt.
Until the next time, John. All the best. Lots of love.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much. The 1990s. Do you remember the 1990s? Such a long time ago, back in the last, when we were young people.